In 1857, Margaret Whitmore's house in Marlborough County, South Carolina, was a sign of Southern wealth. The plantation house had 2 stories, white columns, and a wraparound porch. It looked out over cotton fields that went all the way to the PD River. What looked like a model of antebellum elegance would turn out to be the center of one of the most horrifying discoveries in the history of American slavery. 3 years ago, Margaret Whitmore, who is 34 years old, got the plantation from her late husband. She was well known in the county for her good manners and donations to the local Methodist church. She also had 7 slaves working for her at home. One of them was a 22-year-old woman named Delilah Hayes, who was smart and calm enough to be Mrs. Whitmore's personal attendant. The first sign that something was wrong came from an unexpected source. Reverend Thomas Caldwell of the Marlborough Methodist Church wrote down something in his personal journal that would later turn out to be important. He noticed something strange about Delilah Hayes when he came to bless the Whitmore family once a month. She would arrange flowers in the parlor in a way that looked planned but was hard to explain. There were always 3, 5, or 7 stems in a group. When asked about this arrangement, Delilah would just say that it made Mrs. Whitmore happy. Reverend Caldwell had no idea that Delilah Hayes had come up with a way to talk to people that would reveal one of Marlborough County's best-kept secrets. She had come up with a way to record information that her mistress thought would never be found, thanks to years of careful observation and amazing creativity. The Whitmore plantation pretended to be a typical Southern place of hospitality. Mrs. Whitmore often had guests over for dinner parties for the local gentry and gave a lot of money to church events. Her guests often said nice things about the great training of her staff, especially how Delilah Hayes quietly and efficiently handled the household tasks. They didn't notice the small patterns that Delilah used in everything she did every day. The flower arrangements were just one part of a complicated system. Delilah would fold linens in certain ways, put books on shelves in a way that only she understood, and move furniture around in small ways that looked random but were actually part of a planned pattern. Every change, every arrangement, and every action that seemed random was part of a record-keeping process that would eventually show what really happened in the Whitmore house. Mrs. Whitmore's reputation in the community was beyond reproach after the guests left. People knew her as a kind employer who treated her slaves well, gave a lot to charity, and lived by Christian values. The Marlborough County Courthouse's local records show that she had never been charged with any crimes related to how she treated her property. The records of the Methodist Church show that she went to church regularly and gave a lot of money. To everyone else, Margaret Whitmore was the perfect example of a Southern woman. But Delilah Hayes saw a different side of her mistress when they were alone in the plantation house, especially on long winter nights when no one else was around. Mrs. Whitmore's behavior would change, and Delilah started to keep track of it through her complicated system of changing the environment. Delilah's system needed a lot of intelligence and memory. She gave numbers to different things in the house and where they were. For example, a book with the spine facing in was worth one number, and a book with the spine facing out was worth another. Candles, placed at different heights on their holders, showed different types of information. The way she put Mrs. Whitmore's things in her bedroom even followed this code. Delilah started to write down a pattern of behavior that went against everything the community thought they knew about Margaret Whitmore. The arrangements documented occurrences of verbal abuse, physical intimidation, and psychological manipulation that transpired in the absence of witnesses. Even more troubling, the coded arrangements started to show how Mrs. Whitmore interacted with other members of the household staff. This showed a systematic pattern of control and punishment that went far beyond what was thought to be normal at the time. An unexpected source gave us the key to understanding Delilah's system. Jonathan Whitmore, Mrs. Whitmore's nephew, came from Charleston in the spring of 1858 to take care of some family business. Jonathan was 26 years old and had just graduated from the College of Charleston. He was very interested in math and patterns. He started to notice the same patterns in the house during his 3-week stay. Jonathan, on the other hand, saw the mathematical precision behind Delilah's work, unlike the other visitors who had said that the exact organization was due to good training. He noticed that the arrangements changed every day, but they followed rules that made it seem like there was a method to the madness. Because he had a background in math, he could see what others couldn't. This wasn't random organization. It was a complex encoding system. Jonathan's initial interest made him start writing down the arrangements himself. He drew pictures of where different things were, wrote down the number patterns and flower arrangements, and kept track of how things changed from day to day. He found that the arrangements were very complicated, which showed that they were made with a purpose and intelligence. A tragedy that showed the full extent of Mrs. Whitmore's hidden nature led to the discovery of the system's meaning. A woman named Ruth Thompson, who was enslaved and worked in the kitchen, was found dead in her room in late May 1858. Dr. Henry Morrison wrote down that the official cause of death was heart failure. But the way Delilah planned things in the days after Ruth's death told a different story. In the week after Ruth's death, the way things were arranged around the house made a pattern that Jonathan started to figure out with his math skills. He began to realize that the flower groupings, book positions, and candle heights were all parts of a time record that showed what had happened in the plantation house. Jonathan found proof that Ruth Thompson's death was not caused by natural causes by figuring out Delilah's code. The way things were set up suggested that Mrs. Whitmore and Ruth were going to fight over some missing silverware from the dining room. The coded record says that Mrs. Whitmore accused Ruth of stealing and punished her in a way that led to her death. The arrangement made it seem like Ruth had been stuck in a root cellar under the kitchen for days without food or water. Delilah's system was more advanced than just keeping records. She had added many layers of meaning to the arrangements, which let her record not only what happened, but also what happened next and what happened after that. For example, the way Mrs. Whitmore's personal Bible was placed on her nightstand was linked to certain types of punishments given to the household staff. The way the curtains were drawn showed how bad Mrs. Whitmore's moods were and how likely she was to be violent. As Jonathan learned more about the system, he was horrified by what he was seeing. The coded arrangements showed years of abuse that had been carefully kept secret from the outside world. They showed a pattern of psychological manipulation, physical punishment, and systematic degradation that was the opposite of what Mrs. Whitmore showed to the public. Jonathan faced a moral and legal dilemma when he chose to act on this information. In 1858 South Carolina, the testimony of enslaved people was not legally valid against white property owners. Delilah's testimony would not be accepted in any court of law, even if she could be persuaded to do so. Any legal authority would see the coded plans as the fantasy of an ignorant slave, even though they were clever. But Jonathan had something that made the accusations more believable. He had seen Mrs. Whitmore's character for himself while he was staying with her. He had seen how she treated the staff when she thought no one was watching. He had seen how scared the enslaved workers were when Mrs. Whitmore came into a room. Most importantly, he had seen something that proved that Delilah's coded records were correct. Jonathan saw Mrs. Whitmore's reaction to a small accident in the dining room on the evening of June 2, 1858. Delilah had spilled a glass of water by mistake while serving dinner. Mrs. Whitmore's response was quick and violent. She hit Delilah in the face hard enough to knock her down, and then she verbally attacked her, showing how much she hated the woman who worked for her every day. Jonathan was able to see how Delilah recorded the event through her arrangement system, which made this incident even more important. The next morning, things in the house were in different places than they had been the night before, just like Jonathan had seen. He felt sure about the other things the system said because it was right. Jonathan's health and mood started to suffer because of the moral weight of the knowledge. He couldn't sleep because he couldn't stop thinking about what he had learned. The arrangements showed not only single acts of cruelty, but also a pattern of abuse that had been going on for years. They wrote down the deaths of at least 3 other enslaved people, and the way they died made it clear that they weren't from natural causes. The coded plans also showed Jonathan something else that really upset him: proof that Mrs. Whitmore wasn't working alone. The system recorded visits from other plantation owners in the area who took part in what could only be called systematic torture sessions. The plans showed that these meetings happened once a month, always when there were no real guests expected, and always had serious consequences for the household staff. Colonel William Harrison, Judge Robert Stackhouse, and Dr. Henry Morrison were some of the most respected people in Marlborough County society whose names were recorded through Delilah's system. Their participation in these gatherings was recorded through the coded arrangements. The fact that the people in charge of keeping the peace were also involved in these activities explained why such widespread abuse could go on without anyone noticing. Jonathan's investigation into the meaning of Delilah's arrangements had shown that not only was Delilah cruel, but there was also a network of sadistic behavior among the county's elite. When you look at the cover-up, the official dismissal of deaths as natural causes, and the lack of any legal scrutiny as part of a coordinated effort to protect the people involved, everything suddenly makes sense. Jonathan was tormented by the question of what to do with this information. If Delilah and the other staff members directly confronted Mrs. Whitmore, it would do nothing and probably lead to serious problems for them. Legal authorities were compromised by their own involvement in the activities being recorded. The county's social and political structure made it impossible to use any normal way to get justice. Jonathan made a choice during the last week of his stay that would have big effects. Instead of trying to work within a broken system, he decided to write down everything he had learned so that he could expose the network through channels outside of Marlborough County. He started to keep detailed records of Delilah's system by turning the coded arrangements into written accounts of the events they recorded. Jonathan worked alone in his room in the early morning hours to write down years of hidden history. The arrangements showed that there had been ongoing abuse since Mrs. Whitmore married her late husband. They wrote down the deaths of enslaved people who had been thought to have run away. They showed that there was a group of rich planters who met often to do things that would shock even the most hardened observers. The cover-up was just as smart as the abuse. The plans explained how deaths were faked to look natural, how bodies were disposed of, and how official records were changed. They showed how Dr. Morrison gave out fake death certificates, and Judge Stackhouse ignored any questions that came up. The system showed that there was a lot of corruption in the county government, even at the highest levels. Jonathan got in touch with Delilah on his last morning at the plantation to make sure he understood how her system worked. The kitchen was empty except for the 2 people talking before dawn, while the rest of the house slept. What he learned from that short conversation was worse than anything he could have imagined about what the plans had written down. Delilah said that the coded system was a record of what happened in the plantation house, but she also said that it was only one part of a bigger network of communication. Other enslaved people on plantations all over the county had made similar systems. The information was being shared and organized in more than one place. Jonathan had found not just one woman's account of abuse, but also part of a large intelligence network that had been working in secret for years. This news had huge effects. The enslaved people had created their own way of investigating and keeping records that their owners had no idea about. They had been gathering proof, organizing facts, and keeping a complete record of the crimes that were being committed against them. Delilah's flower arrangements were just one part of a secret information network that covered the whole area. Jonathan's leaving the Whitmore plantation was the start of a risky mission. He brought with him detailed copies of Delilah's coded records and notes on the systematic abuse he had seen. He was going to Charleston, where he hoped to find officials who weren't part of the corrupt network he had found in Marlborough County. But the network reached farther than Jonathan thought it would. People who somehow knew about his investigation got in touch with him just a few days after he got to Charleston. It was clear that his questions about what was going on in Marlborough County were not welcome and could be dangerous. It was suggested that he might be happier living his life in a different state altogether. The threat was enough to make Jonathan think that taking direct action through the courts was not an option, but he wouldn't give up the evidence he had found. Instead, he wrote down everything in a detailed account and gave it to a trusted friend in Charleston, telling them to keep it safe and maybe publish it at some point in the future when conditions might allow for justice. Back at the Whitmore plantation, Delilah kept track of what was going on with her arrangement system. But she also changed how she did things when she found out that Jonathan had figured out her code. The arrangements got more complicated and the patterns got more complex. She had learned that other people could understand her system, which made it easier for her to talk to them. The plantation had a quiet summer in 1858. Mrs. Whitmore kept up her public image as a kind Christian woman, but the staff at home were afraid of her private outbursts of rage. County officials kept meeting once a month, and Delilah kept recording what they did in more and more complex patterns of arrangement. In September, Delilah got in touch with an unexpected ally, which was a big step forward. Marcus Williams, a free black carpenter who sometimes worked on plantation maintenance projects, had seen how things were arranged when he visited different properties. He was able to see that what he was seeing was part of a system because of his own intelligence and education. Jonathan found the code by accident, but Marcus went straight to Delilah to ask about the patterns. Delilah and Marcus's relationship opened up new ways to document and possibly expose the network of abuse. Marcus knew a lot of people in the area, not just the people who were enslaved. He was a free person of color, which meant he could go to places and get information that slaves couldn't. Most importantly, he knew people in the North who were against slavery and might be able to do something with the information he was gathering. Delilah's coded arrangement started to reach more people through Marcus. People wrote down the information and sent it through secret networks that eventually got to people in Philadelphia and Boston who were sympathetic. Even experienced abolitionists who had seen many accounts of plantation abuse were impressed by how detailed and sophisticated the documentation was. The evidence was organized in a way that made this case stand out to them. It showed that there was a network of people working together. But the process of exposing the network would turn out to be more dangerous than anyone thought it would be. Marcus Williams went missing in October 1858, while on a normal work trip between plantations. A few days later, they found his body in a remote area near the PD River. The official decision was that the person died by drowning, but the facts pointed to something else. The death of Marcus Williams made it clear to anyone who might want to upset the established order in Marlborough County that they shouldn't. But it also had an unintended effect. It made other people want to do something. The group of enslaved people who had been making their own ways to talk to each other realized that just writing things down wasn't enough anymore. It was time to take more direct action. During the winter of 1858, the underground information network became more advanced and better organized. Delilah's system for organizing things changed over time to include new parts that made it easier to talk to people. The placement of farming tools, the way kitchen tools were arranged, and even the way clothes were hung out to dry, all started to have hidden meanings that only people who knew the system could understand. The information shared on these networks showed the full extent of the organized abuse happening all over the county. There were many plantations involved. Dozens of officials were involved, and the cover-up was so widespread that it reached banks, churches, and government offices. There was proof of a conspiracy among the enslaved people that went all the way to the top of local society. The abolitionist groups in the North responded quickly, but they had to keep it a secret. Plans started to come together for a coordinated effort to bring down the Marlborough County network. But the dangerous fate of Marcus Williams showed how risky any direct action can be. To avoid the same sad results, the approach would have to be carefully thought out and carried out. An unexpected source gave me the chance to do something. William Patterson, a young journalist, came to South Carolina in early 1859 to write a series of articles for a Boston newspaper about life on a plantation. Patterson's job was to write about the daily lives and social structures of Southern farmers. He never thought that he would be the key to exposing one of the most organized abuse conspiracies in American history. At first, Patterson's approach to his job was normal. He set up visits to a number of plantations in the area, talked to owners and overseers, and watched how things were done in the fields and at home. His early articles for the Boston Herald talked about how well-organized and efficient plantation farming was, in a way that was typical of Northern journalism at the time. Patterson, on the other hand, had traits that made him more observant than most people who visited Southern plantations. He had learned math and science in school, which helped him see patterns that other people might not have noticed. More importantly, his training as a journalist had taught him to look beyond what he saw on the surface and to question what the government said about events. Patterson saw Delilah's arrangement system when he went to the Whitmore plantation in February 1859. Patterson saw the mathematical sophistication behind the patterns, which was different from what other visitors had said about them being a sign of good training. His later investigation into what these arrangements meant would reveal the whole network. It took Patterson several weeks of careful watching and thinking to figure out what Delilah's code meant. Patterson was able to understand the basic ideas behind the arrangement system by using the transcriptions that Jonathan Whitmore had left with his friend in Charleston. Delilah, on the other hand, had been working on and improving the code since Jonathan left, which made the current arrangements more complicated than what had been written down before. The big breakthrough happened when Patterson realized that the arrangements were not just keeping track of individual events, but were also making a complete record of history. The patterns of each day built on those of the day before, creating a story that went back years. This historical documentation was just as advanced as regular written records and gave a level of detail that would have been impossible to get in any other way. Patterson found proof of planned murder, torture, and conspiracy involving some of South Carolina's most important citizens by looking at the arrangements. The documents showed not only individual acts of cruelty, but also a network that worked with the knowledge and protection of local authorities. Patterson was so shocked by the implications that he first thought he had misread the coded information. Patterson verified the accuracy of the arrangement system by watching current events and then writing them down in Delilah's patterns. Mrs. Whitmore's reaction to hearing about a business setback in early March included a violent outburst toward the household staff. Patterson saw both the event and how it was later coded into the arrangement patterns, which proved that the system was a reliable historical record. Patterson faced both professional and moral problems when he had to decide what to do with this information. The story could have made him famous and helped his career a lot. But the safety of the people who gave the information was the most important thing. If the coded systems were exposed too soon or carelessly, the people who made and kept them could die. Patterson's answer was to come up with a plan that would show the network while keeping his sources safe. He used his contacts with abolitionists in the North to get his findings published at the same time in a number of newspapers in a number of states. The planned release would make it hard for the people behind the plot to keep the information secret or get back at certain people. It took several more months to finish the investigation. Patterson stayed in South Carolina until the summer of 1859 to gather more evidence and check the information in the coded arrangements. His research showed that the Marlborough County network was part of a bigger conspiracy that spread into North Carolina and Georgia. the evidence that had been gathered against the cover-up was just as complicated as the cover-up itself. The enslaved people had written down not only the crimes, but also the ways they were hidden. They had written down the forgery of death certificates, the bribery of officials, and the threats made to possible witnesses. The documents showed how this kind of abuse could go on for years without anyone noticing. Patterson's last step in the investigation was to make sure that the network's activities were still going on. In August 1859, he was able to see one of the monthly meetings that Delilah had been writing about in her arrangements. Patterson saw things that confirmed the accuracy of the coded records and proved that the conspiracy was still going on at the Whitmore plantation, where he was hiding in the woods. Patterson's exposé came out in September 1859 and caused the exact stir he had hoped for. The story was in newspapers all over the North, and the proof was so clear that even people who didn't believe it were convinced. The coded arrangement system's detailed records gave the story more credibility than previous accounts of plantation abuse had. But the South Carolina authorities acted quickly and as expected. Patterson was taken into custody for trespassing and disturbing the peace. Mrs. Whitmore and the other people involved denied all the charges and said that the coded arrangements were made up by their enslaved workers to cause problems. The official response was to call the whole story abolitionist propaganda meant to hurt the South's reputation. The legal proceedings that followed showed that it was impossible to get justice through normal means. Even though there was a lot of evidence, no one was charged with a crime. The testimony of enslaved witnesses was thrown out, and Patterson's observations were called biased reporting by a Northern agitator. Within a few months, the case was closed, and no one involved in the conspiracy faced any legal consequences. But the exposure had effects that went beyond the legal system. The detailed reports of systematic abuse and the discovery of an organized conspiracy caused a scandal that hurt the reputations of those involved. Some of the people who were accused saw their social and business relationships change because of the accusations. More importantly, the exposure messed up the network's operations and made it impossible for things to go on as they had before. The people who gave the evidence had different fates. Shortly after the story came out, Delilah Hayes and a few other enslaved people went missing from the Whitmore plantation. According to official records, they were sold to plantations in other states. However, networks of abolitionists suggest that they may have been helped to escape to freedom through Underground Railroad connections that were set up during the investigation. Until she died in 1862, Mrs. Whitmore lived on the plantation. But the accusations hurt her standing in the community and she never got it back. The monthly meetings stopped, and some of the officials who were involved either retired or moved to other areas. Even though legal justice was never served, the exposure did stop the network from working and breaking up. One of the most advanced examples of resistance and documentation in the history of American slavery is the coded arrangement system that Delilah Hayes created. Her work is as accurate mathematically and historically as that of trained historians and journalists. It takes a lot of bravery and intelligence to keep such detailed records while living in a place where you are always being watched and could be hurt. The extensive communication networks established among the enslaved populace of Marlborough County indicate that the historical documentation of plantation life may be significantly deficient. The capacity of enslaved individuals to document, organize, and safeguard evidence of their experiences signifies that they had significantly greater agency and intellectual capability than traditional historical accounts have recognized. The case also shows how people in power can work together to hide systematic abuse. The participation of judges, physicians, and other officials in both the perpetration and concealment of crimes illustrates how institutional corruption can render justice unattainable through traditional legal avenues. The conspiracy needed more than just individual acts of cruelty. It needed systematic cooperation between different levels of local government and society. The technical sophistication of Delilah's documentation system makes one wonder what other unusual ways historical events might have been recorded. The capacity to encode intricate information into ostensibly ordinary domestic configurations indicates that significant historical data may be present in formats overlooked by conventional historical research methodologies. The bravery of those who helped document and expose the network shows that people can stand up for what they believe in, even when things are really bad. One of the best things about people is that they are willing to risk their lives to protect evidence of wrongdoing and hold those responsible for systematic abuse accountable. In 1867, during the Reconstruction era, federal investigators looked at local records as part of a larger effort to learn more about slavery in South Carolina. This led to more evidence of the Marlborough County network coming to light. The investigators found references to the coded arrangement systems and documents that abolitionist networks had kept, which added to the proof of what Patterson had written about. But by then, most of the people who were part of the conspiracy had either died or moved away from the area. The chance for legal accountability had passed, and the focus of Reconstruction was on rebuilding instead of punishing people for crimes they had already committed. The case turned into a historical footnote instead of a way for the people who had been abused to get justice. The records that Delilah Hayes and the other enslaved people who were part of the information network gave were eventually stored in archives kept by abolitionist groups in the North. These records give one of the most detailed pictures of life on a plantation from the point of view of the people who lived there. Historians have had a hard time fully understanding and using the coded information to put together the historical record. The Marlborough County case has a legacy that goes beyond its immediate historical importance. It shows how important it is to recognize other types of records and resistance that may not fit with traditional historical sources. The complexity of the enslaved population's response to their circumstances contests prevailing notions of literacy, intelligence, and agency that have shaped historical analyses of the slavery era. The case also shows how institutional problems can make it hard to get justice, even when there is strong evidence. Because local authorities were involved in both the crime and the cover-up, traditional legal remedies were not possible. Instead, other ways had to be found to hold people accountable and expose the crime. This pattern is useful for understanding other times in history when institutional corruption has protected systematic abuse. Delilah Hayes's unique coded arrangement system is a great example of how creative thinking can happen even when there are a lot of limits. Her ability to make a complete documentation system using only the materials and chances available in a plantation household shows how people can be innovative and resistant, even when things are very limited. The story of how a beautiful enslaved woman used a seemingly dumb trick to show the truth that her mistress was trying to hide is proof of how smart and brave people can be when they stand up to systemic injustice. The coded arrangements that looked like proof of good training to people who weren't paying close attention were actually very advanced historical records that kept proof of crimes that would have stayed hidden forever. The silence that followed the exposure of the Marlborough County network was not the silence of resolution. It was the silence of a society that was not ready to deal with all the consequences of what had been said. The proof was too much. The paperwork was too complicated. And the bravery of the people who gave it was amazing. But the institutional structures that had allowed the abuse to happen stayed in place, making it impossible to hold anyone accountable. Today, historical societies in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania keep the documents that Delilah Hayes used to keep her coded arrangement system. Researchers are still trying to figure out what all the mathematical patterns that hid years of history really mean. Every new piece of information about her system sheds light on life under slavery in a way that goes against what most historians say and gives us a better idea of what it was like for people whose voices were left out of official records. The truth that came out of those carefully arranged flowers, perfectly placed books, and candles that were angled on purpose was that systematic evil could be documented, exposed, and stopped, even when normal ways of getting justice were broken or not available. The bravery and intelligence of the people who made and kept these documentation systems up and running show that the human spirit can never be broken, no matter how bad things get. And maybe that's the most disturbing truth of all, that such complex systems of documentation and resistance were needed, that the institutional protections that should have stopped such widespread abuse were actually part of the conspiracy to hide it, and that justice could only be served by the extraordinary bravery and intelligence of those who had the most to lose by telling the truth. The echoes of those coded arrangements continued to resonate through American history, reminding us that the official record may not tell the whole story, that those who seemed powerless may have had ways to fight back that have not been fully acknowledged, and that the search for justice sometimes needs methods and courage that go far beyond normal legal and social channels. After the Marlborough County network was made public, there was a silence that was not a sign of resolution, but rather a sign that society was not ready to deal with the full effects of what had been revealed. The proof was too much, the paperwork was too complicated, and the bravery of the people who gave it was amazing. But the institutional structures that had allowed the abuse to happen stayed in place, so it was impossible to hold anyone accountable in a meaningful way. In 1863, almost 4 years after Patterson's story came out, the Civil War brought federal troops to Marlborough County. Some of the papers taken from abandoned plantation houses were pieces of Delilah's coded arrangements that had been kept by later household staff who had learned parts of her system. These pieces gave more proof that the network was real and working. In February 1862, Margaret Whitmore died at home, reportedly from pneumonia. But those who knew Delilah's documentation system saw that the woman who had hurt so many had died alone, with no one from the community that had once praised her charitable work. In the end, the fear and loneliness she had caused in others had become her own fate. After Mrs. Whitmore died, the plantation house was empty for a few years. People who lived nearby said they heard strange noises coming from the building on quiet nights. These weren't supernatural events, but the settling of old wood and the sound of wind blowing through rooms where terrible secrets had been carefully recorded by arranging everyday objects in a certain way. Samuel Hayes, a freedman, bought the property in 1868, during Reconstruction. He was not related to Delilah, even though they had the same last name. During renovations, Samuel found a few things hidden in the walls. Small bundles of dried flowers arranged in certain ways, pieces of paper with math notes on them, and a wooden box with what looked like a rough but organized calendar marked with symbols that matched Delilah's coding system. These new pieces of information proved once and for all how advanced and widespread the documentation network had been for years, without anyone knowing about it. The hidden materials were a backup system that Delilah had made to keep the most important evidence safe in case her main way of organizing things was found or broken. There was also something else in the wooden box, a single piece of paper with carefully written words on it. The note said, "Truth finds a way to survive, even when those who speak it cannot." It was short but powerful. It is now in the Freedmen's Bureau archives as the last proof of one of the most amazing examples of resistance and documentation in American history. Delilah Hayes not only survived being a slave, but she also left behind a legacy that would last longer than her abusers and the system that protected them. The truth she told through her seemingly simple plans had shown a web of evil that was built into the very fabric of local society. Even though legal justice was never served, the exposure stopped the conspiracy from going on. More importantly, her methods showed that even in the worst situations, people could still use their intelligence and bravery to find ways to record the truth and keep evidence for future generations. The code she wrote was easy to keep an eye on all the time, but it was also smart enough to keep years of detailed historical data safe. Her legacy continued, not only through the specific disclosures regarding the Marlborough County network, but also by demonstrating that individuals who seemed powerless had extraordinary agency and the resolve to wield it in pursuit of justice. Historians still look at the pieces of Delilah's system that have been kept today. Every new insight into her methods gives us more information about the lives of people whose voices were left out of official records. Her work is a testament to how strong people can be when they fight back, and how powerful the truth can be, even when people try to hide it. The beautiful enslaved woman who did a stupid thing that looked like an obsession with neatness was actually the one who made one of the most complex systems of historical documentation and resistance in American history. Her legacy reminds us that truth, like the flowers she used to encode it, can bloom even in the darkest places. And maybe that's the most important lesson of all, that evil, no matter how well organized or protected by institutional power, can't completely stop people from recording the truth, keeping evidence, and making sure that injustice comes to light. The arrangements have long since been disturbed, the flowers have withered, and the books have been reshuffled. But the truth they contained still rings true through history. This is a testament to the remarkable courage and intelligence of a woman who found a way to make her voice heard across the centuries by simply putting things where they needed to be.